Welcome to VSOW. Today we invite you to join us on a fascinating deep dive into one of the great paradoxes of human decision-making. How the seemingly irrational, with psychology terms, magical thinking, doesn't just influence our private superstitions, but actually, well, it actively costs us money.
That's right.
Hmm.
And it drives anxiety and it dictates how we interact with uncertain financial risk. It's quite something.
It really is. So, our mission today, folks, is to unpack a compelling stack of source material. We're looking at findings from behavioral economics experiments, specifically from the Journal of Behavioral and Experimental Economics, and also clinical reviews that focus on psychopathology.
Yeah, things like obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, and generalized anxiety disorder, GAD. We're trying to find the common thread. What links a person choosing to forego a guaranteed higher profit in a simple lottery with someone who spends hours performing rituals, to prevent some imagined disaster?
Okay, let's unpack this core tension right at the start because it's fascinating. We are talking about behavior that leads people to reject the objectively rational choice, the choice that maximizes their economic gain.
Hmm.
And they do this because of a fear of something abstract, something like tempting fate.
Exactly. Magical thinking, at its heart, it's the belief that your thoughts, your words, or maybe your ritualistic actions can directly affect the outcome of chance events.
Hmm.
Things happening out there in the external world.
Independent of any objective physical cause, right? That's the key.
That's the absolute key. It's this ultimate collision between our inner intuitive world and, well, external economic reality.
Yeah.
The behavior, it seems, is driven by a deep-seated System 1 gut feeling.
System one, that fast automatic thinking.
Precisely. That intuitive part that tells us, hey, if I push too hard, if I ask for too much, I might get punished somehow.
Even when our rational mind, our system two, knows mathematically that the probability of success hasn't changed one bit.
Exactly. System 2 is saying the odds are the same, but System 1 is whispering, don't risk it. Understanding this mechanism is, well, it's vital because the economic costs and the emotional costs, too, they're significant.
Absolutely. Whether you're in a lab choosing between prizes or out in the real world choosing, say, an insurance plan.
Right. The stakes can be very high.
So before we dive into those costs, maybe we should anchor ourselves firmly in the definitions. When we talk about magical thinking, especially in a professional or academic context, what are the established concepts we're really drawing upon?
Okay, good idea. So formally, magical thinking, or MT as it's often abbreviated, is basically the attribution of causal links, where, objectively speaking, none exist.
Okay.
A key component, especially in the clinical literature, is this idea that thinking is equivalent to action. Sometimes it's called the omnipotence of thoughts.
Omnipotence of thoughts.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. That sounds pretty powerful.
It implies that merely having a thought is, in some way, the exact embodiment of an event happening, or at the very least, that the thought significantly influences the probability of that event occurring.
That's a heavy burden for a thought. I find the historical context here really illuminating. It shows this isn't some, modern psychological quirk, but a fundamental way the human mind tried to make sense of reality long before the scientific method came along. Didn't early anthropological work actually lay down specific laws that seem to govern these magical beliefs?
Oh, absolutely. You're thinking of anthropologists like Sir James Frazer. In his major work, The Golden Bough, he really tried to break down these principles. The first one he identified is the law of similarity.
Law of similarity.
Yeah, this suggests that produces or put another way, that in effect resembles its cause.
Yeah.
This is sort of the root of practices like, say, using voodoo dolls. The idea is if you perform an action on a representation of a person, the doll, that action will magically affect the actual person. The image and the reality are linked simply because they look similar.
Okay, that makes sense in a magical way. And the second law you mentioned focuses on contact.
That's the law of contagion, or sometimes called the law of contact. This principle suggests that things that were once in contact, they remain connected somehow. Even at a distance, they continue to influence each other even after they've been physically separated.
Ah, so that explains why people might value relics so highly. Like a piece of clothing worn by a famous person.
Exactly. Or, conversely, why someone might avoid wearing a jacket they had on during, say, a bad accident. There's this feeling that the bad luck or the negative influence somehow remains attached, contagious, to the fabric itself. So these symbolic actions, whether they're physical or just mental, they're believed to exert a real, tangible influence on reality. They seem to override physics itself in the believer's mind.
This brings up a really important question, I think, for our listeners. Maybe someone listening crosses their fingers now and then, or avoids stepping on cracks. Is this capacity for magical thinking necessarily a sign of, psychological ill health? Where does it actually sit on the spectrum of normal human behavior?
That's a crucial point. It's really important to emphasize that MT is, well, it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And in most contexts, it's entirely normative. It exists on a continuum.
So most people do it to some degree.
Absolutely. Nearly everyone engages in some low-level magical thinking. Think about it. How many perfectly rational adults do you know who might knock on wood, or carry a lucky charm, or have a specific routine before a big presentation or a sporting event?
Yeah, lots.
Right. These are usually fleeting. They're often socially accepted instances of MT, and they're not inherently pathological. They're just part of the human experience.
And if we look at how we develop, this tendency seems, well, deeply ingrained, right from the earliest stages of how we think.
It really is.
Yeah.
Developmental psychology, particularly building on the work of Jean Piaget, notes that magical thinking is actually a defining characteristic of the pre-operational stage. This is typically between ages 3 and 5.
Okay, young kids.
Yeah. And it manifests as things like animism, the belief that inanimate objects are alive or have intentions, or maybe confusing a symbol or a name with the actual physical object itself.
Right.
But, and this is important, this stage isn't just about cognitive limitations. It's tightly linked to the crucial development of imagination, language, and memory formation. It serves a purpose.
And didn't the sources mention that engaging in this sort of fantastical thinking can actually have concrete cognitive benefits?
Yes, they did. There was a compelling study cited where children who watched a short magical film, basically a film showing impossible, fantastical events, they actually performed significantly better on subsequent tasks designed to measure creativity and divergent thinking.
Better than kids who didn't see the magical stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. Better than their peers in a control group. So this reinforces the idea that the capacity for imaginative thought, even thought that borders on the magical, seems to positively impact our overall cognitive development and maybe even our artistic capacity.
So if this ability is developmental and maybe even beneficial in some ways, why does it stick around into adulthood? Especially when we have, fully functional rational systems. If I know crossing my fingers doesn't actually help my friend find their lost keys, why might I still do it? This seems to point right back to that dual system explanation of behavior you mentioned earlier.
It absolutely does. It's that constant tension, that push and pull between System 1 and System 2. System 2, remember, is our deliberative rational system. It knows the objective laws of probability and causality,
Right.
or at least you can figure them out.
Right, the slow, effortful thinking.
But System 1 is intuitive, it's fast, it's driven by associations and emotions.
Right.
So an adult might possess the full rational knowledge, System 2 knowledge that these magical links are, well, scientifically false. But the powerful automatic association triggered by uncertainty, that's System 1, it still exerts a really strong influence. It creates that gut feeling.
That little voice saying, just in case.
Precisely. When faced with the possibility of a negative outcome, the intuitive system often defaults to the path of ritual or avoidance, just in case, overriding the rational calculation that System 2 is trying to make.
Okay, this leads us perfectly into the realm of behavioral economics, where that just-in-case feeling, that gut instinct, directly translates into lost money, lost capital.
Let's move into that now and discuss the core phenomenon highlighted in those behavioral studies. This irrational foregoing of wealth that seems driven by a fear of being greedy, or, as you said, tempting fate.
Okay. The initial experiments described in the sources were brilliantly simple, really. They were designed specifically to isolate this feeling of greed. Participants were presented with choices between positive lotteries. These lotteries were objectively identical in terms of their winning probability, but they varied only in the monetary value of the prize.
Can you give us an example? Sure. Imagine a standard 6-sided die. You have to select a number to win. But first, you have to choose your prize if you do win. Let's say the options are 16 pounds, 19 pounds, 21 oligons, or the maximum possible gain, 23 prowess.
Okay.
The probability of winning is always 1 in 6, right? It doesn't matter which prize amount you choose. Your odds of rolling the winning number stay the same.
Right. So the economically dominant strategy is crystal clear. Always choose the 23 pounds. If the objective likelihood of winning is identical, maximizing the potential payoff is the only rational decision. There's no downside to picking the higher amount.
Absolutely. Rationally, there's zero reason not to pick 23 pounds. Yet in the initial findings reported, only 69% of participants chose the highest, most rational amount.
Wait, only 69%, so nearly a third didn't.
Exactly. A
Okay.
remarkable 31%, almost 1 in 3 people, irrationally forewent the dominant option. They chose a smaller guaranteed prize if they won. They were willingly sacrificing potential money, in some cases £7, purely, it seems, to avoid a perceived risk associated with asking for too much.
Wow, that loss is entirely self-imposed then. And this is where the tempting fate hypothesis comes in, right? Explain that mechanism again.
The tempting fate hypothesis essentially posits that in situations involving uncertainty, individuals subconsciously, or sometimes consciously, believe that being overtly greedy, asking for the maximum possible gain, will somehow be magically punished.
Punished by who or what?
By the universe, maybe? Or some unseen external force, fate, luck. It's not always clearly defined. But the core belief is that this punishment manifests as a decrease in the probability of achieving the desired outcome. Asking for too much makes you less likely to get it.
And the researchers actually managed to quantify this link between that belief and the action of choosing a lower prize.
They did, yeah. The avoidance of a highest price choice, the 23 times in our example, was found to be significantly correlated with the participants' self-reported belief in the concept of tempting fate. The correlation coefficient, for those interested, was R equals 0.336.
Okay, what does R.336 mean in plain English for you, the listener?
It means that over 30% of the statistical variation, why some people chose the lower amount and others didn't, was directly explained by their explicit, stated fear of tempting fate. This helps confirm that this irrational choice isn't just random noise or confusion. It appears to be driven by a measurable, magical belief system.
Now, it seems vital here to differentiate this from a more general sense of karma, or maybe what psychologists call a belief in a just world.
Yeah.
How is tempting fate different?
That distinction is key, you're right. The belief in a just world is a broader framework. It suggests that generally, good behavior tends to be rewarded and bad behavior punished, kind of balancing the scales over time.
Okay.
Tempting fate, however, is much more specific. It requires the punishment to be ironic and directly related to the transgression, to the sin, as it were.
Ironic, how so?
Well, in the lottery example, the sin is greed asking for too much money. The punishment, therefore, must be directly related. You lose the lottery because you were greedy. It's not just that you have some unrelated bad luck later that week. It has to be a precise, magical feedback loop tied to the specific greedy action.
That makes sense. Okay, but skeptics, myself included perhaps, might suggest another explanation. Maybe the participants were simply worried about social perception. Maybe they chose a smaller prize because they didn't want the experimenter who was watching them choose to think they were overly greedy or selfish. Did the researchers control for this potential experimenter bias?
Yes, they were very careful about this. They designed Study 2 specifically to isolate the motivation, using something called the NIS-70 lottery experiment. They had two conditions: hidden versus observed.
Okay, how did that work?
In the observed condition, the researcher could clearly see which prize level the participant chose, say NIS 70, 65, or 60 shekels. But in the hidden condition, the participant's choice was recorded privately. The experimenter only saw the final result of the lottery draw. They never actually knew which prize amount the participant had selected beforehand.
Okay, so if the avoidance was primarily about looking modest for the experimenter, we'd expect people to choose the lower amount much more often in the observed condition, right?
Exactly. That would be the prediction if it was purely social performance. But the findings showed something different. The avoidance of the highest prize, the NIS 70, occurred frequently, even in the hidden condition, where no one was watching the choice itself.
How frequently? Was there a difference?
Well, 62% chose the highest prize when they were being observed. But a very similar 51% still chose the highest prize, even when their choice was hidden. The difference between 62% and 51% wasn't statistically significant.
So basically, taking away the observer didn't really change the behavior much.
Pretty much. It demonstrates that the choice avoidance can't be primarily explained by participants trying to impress the experimenter or appear less greedy socially. The fear of tempting fate seems to be an internalized, self-motivated magical fear, not just putting on a show for someone else.
That is compelling. It really points to the magic being internal, a personal belief system influencing behavior, even in private. But then Study 3 throws another variable into the mix, doesn't it? It suggests that our very perception of what counts as greedy isn't fixed, it's context-dependent.
Exactly. This complicates the simple rational model even further. Study 3 shifted the context to a casino environment, which involves unknown probabilities, much more like real-world uncertainty than a simple known probability die roll.
Okay.
Participants read a scenario about a woman named Sarah. Sarah was choosing between winning either $400 or $600 in some kind of lottery or game of chance within the casino. The critical manipulation, the key difference between the groups reading the scenario was Sarah's prior experience that day.
Tell us about that manipulation. What was different about Sarah's day?
In one version of the scenario, Sarah had previously won a significant amount of money playing card games earlier that day. She was already ahead. In the other version, she had previously lost money and had actually exhausted her planned budget for the day.
Okay, so she was either on a winning streak or a losing streak, basically.
Right, and the finding was really striking. When Sarah had previously won, participants rated the choice of going for the $600 prize as significantly greedier. And crucially, these participants then estimated the likelihood of her actually winning the $600 to be significantly lower than the likelihood of her winning the $400.
Wow. It's like they believe the universe operates on some kind of luck quota. She'd already used up her share of good fortune for the day, so asking for more felt like an overreach, making it less likely to happen.
That seems to be the intuitive mechanism driving the judgment. Conversely, when Sarah had previously lost money, participants didn't see the $600 choice as particularly greedy. And importantly, they didn't significantly differentiate between the likelihood of her winning $400 versus $600.
So if you haven't been rewarded yet, or maybe if you're just trying to recover a loss, asking for the bigger prize isn't viewed as cosmic greed, and therefore doesn't magically reduce your chances.
That's what the data suggests. The perceived moral status of the choice, is it greedy or not, seems to directly affect the intuitive, gut-level calculation of its objective probability of success.
This is fascinating because it takes this irrationality right out of the controlled lab setting and places it squarely into real-world financial decision-making, where the stakes are obviously much higher than $23 or even $600. What are some of the key real-world implications of this kind of financial magical thinking?
Well, one of the most significant areas is probably in the purchasing of insurance. Standard economic theory suggests people buy insurance based on, objective risk aversion and a rational calculation of probable loss versus the cost of the premium.
Right, a cost-benefit analysis.
But the fear of tempting fate introduces a powerful, non-rational motivator. For example, think about a homeowner. They might buy comprehensive, expensive flood insurance despite living on top of a hill where the statistical risk of flooding is negligible, practically zero.
Why would they do that?
Because not insuring the house, for some people, feels like tempting fate. It feels like a direct challenge to the universe, an invitation for disaster that will inevitably be punished by some freak weather event. The insurance policy, in this view, becomes almost like a ritualistic payment, a sacrifice to appease a potentially punitive fate and keep the floodwaters away.
Paying to not tempt fate. And if we look at situations involving strategic interaction, like bargaining or negotiation, this fear of appearing greedy must lead to suboptimal outcomes there too, surely.
Precisely. Imagine a negotiation over dividing up an asset, let's say a valuable plot of land, but there's an added layer of uncertainty. Maybe there's an external threat, like the local government might suddenly decide to expropriate the land without warning.
Okay, so there's a risk the whole thing could fall through for reasons outside the negotiation itself.
Exactly. Now, if one party in the negotiation pushes really hard for the absolute maximum, maybe arguably greedy share of the potential profit from the land, the fear of tempting fate might kick in.
How?
They might start to believe, subconsciously perhaps, that their aggressive negotiation tactics, their greed, magically increases the probability of that third-party threat, the government expropriation, actually materializing.
So their own greed could trigger the external disaster.
That's the magical fear. Consequently, they might end up making a significantly more generous offer to the other party than is rationally necessary, simply to avoid appearing greedy and hopefully magically prevent the feared external loss. They're actively choosing a worse economic outcome for themselves to satisfy an intuitive magical fear.
It is truly remarkable how a concept that feels so intuitively compelling, don't push your luck, can so effectively distort rational, financially optimal behavior.
It really suggests that any economic model trying to predict behavior under uncertainty needs to explicitly account for this. It needs to consider the non-zero probability that people assign to fate intervening when they perceive their own actions as morally questionable, particularly as greedy, even when there's absolutely no objective evidence for such a link.
Okay, so if this subtle magical thinking can cost rational people real money in a lottery or a negotiation, What happens when this cognitive mechanism spirals completely out of control? When it becomes a truly debilitating psychological disorder? Let's transition now to the clinical context and examine magical thinking OCD, often called MTOCD.
Right. When magical thinking becomes pathological, it really ceases to be just a momentary superstition or a quirky habit. It transforms into a deep, pervasive source of distress. And it seems to be driven primarily by an inflated sense of responsibility.
Inflated responsibility, meaning they feel responsible for things they couldn't possibly control.
Exactly. Individuals with MTOCD genuinely deeply believe that their thoughts, their words, or maybe their ritualistic omissions, things they didn't do, can cause real, often terrible consequences. Usually not just for themselves, but more commonly for their loved ones.
That must be terrifying. The internal conflict must be immense. I mean, the sufferer probably intellectually knows they can't cause a plane crash just by looking at the clock at exactly 9:11, but the anxiety is so acute, so overwhelming, it just demands some kind of neutralizing action.
That's the absolute core of the torment. They possess the System 2 knowledge, the rational understanding that the belief is nonsensical. They know it doesn't make logical sense. Yet the sheer intensity of the anxiety, combined with this profound moral fear of being responsible for potential harm, compels them to perform compulsions anyway, just to be sure, just in case. The person gets trapped in this relentless, exhausting cycle of self-monitoring thoughts and performing neutralization rituals.
Let's delve into the specific nature of the obsessions that are detailed in the clinical literature, because they often seem highly specific and almost arbitrary, don't they?
They really are. Obsessions are those intrusive, unwanted thoughts, images, or urges that trigger the distress in the first place. And they can be incredibly varied and idiosyncratic.
Mhm.
For example, a belief that if you use a red pen instead of a blue one while writing, your mother will get sick.
Wow.
Or the intense need to internally neutralize any negative thought about a loved one, just a fleeting negative thought, by instantly replacing it with a specific number, maybe 3, positive thoughts about them. Or, like your example, the fear that seeing certain numerical sequences, like 9.11 on a clock, acts as some kind of evil omen that must be immediately counteracted through a ritual.
And the compulsions, then, are the ritualistic behaviors that follow, the things they do to try and relieve that intense anxiety.
Precisely. The compulsions are the attempts to mentally or physically undo the perceived magical damage, or to prevent the feared outcome from happening. These behavioral response patterns are often extremely rigid, highly specific, and incredibly time-consuming.
Can you give some examples of compulsions common in MTOCD?
Sure. Things like repeating specific phrases, maybe saying, I love my mother exactly 3 times before closing a door, if 3 is their safe number. Counting is very common, often revolving around specific lucky or safe numbers, while avoiding unlucky ones. You might see individuals feeling compelled to apply makeup a certain number of times, or brush their teeth for a count that feels right, or flick a light switch exactly 4 times if 4 is their safe number, just to ensure the day proceeds safely.
The sheer cognitive burden of having to track all these complex arbitrary rules and constantly monitor for triggers must be absolutely immense.
It's devastating to daily functioning. Compulsions frequently involve meticulous avoidance as well. Avoiding bad numbers, certain colors, specific words that feel dangerous, or even physically avoiding specific locations associated with a bad thought or feeling. For instance, a person might develop a fear that stepping on a sidewalk crack while having a negative thought will magically cause their parents to divorce. This forces them into highly disruptive, conspicuous patterns of walking, constantly scanning and calculating.
Yeah, I can see how that would make just leaving the house incredibly stressful.
In severe MTOCD, these obsessions and compulsions can consume hours upon hours of the day. It can make holding down a job, attending school, or maintaining personal relationships almost impossible.
Now, moving beyond OCD for a moment, the sources also mention that magical thinking can appear in generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, but it seems to serve a fundamentally different purpose there. How does it manifest in GAD?
That's right, it's a different flavor of MT. In GAD, magical thinking often manifests not so much as the fear of causing a negative event through a specific thought or action, but more as a mechanism of pseudo-control, a false sense of control.
Pseudo-control. How so?
The individual with GAD comes to believe, often implicitly rather than explicitly, that their anxious thoughts themselves, their constant excessive worrying, their meticulous overplanning, their mental rehearsal of every possible worst-case scenario are actually what's keeping those negative outcomes from happening.
Ah, so the anxiety itself becomes a kind of necessary shield. Like, if I worry hard enough, a bad thing won't happen.
Exactly. They develop this underlying belief that if they stop worrying excessively or stop their detailed overplanning and hypervigilance, the negative outcome they're constantly anticipating will finally happen. Why? Because the magical protection afforded by their anxiety has been removed.
That must make treatment incredibly difficult.
It makes them highly resistant to therapeutic intervention. Absolutely. Because reducing the anxiety, which is the goal of therapy, feels to them equivalent to relinquishing control and actively inviting disaster. The anxious state, despite being utterly miserable, feels perversely protective and essential for keeping catastrophe at bay.
And finally, when we look at the more severe end of the psychopathology spectrum, MT shifts again. It becomes a clear diagnostic marker for some really serious conditions.
That's correct. High levels of magical thinking are actually listed as a formal diagnostic criterion for schizotypal personality disorder, for example, in classifications like the ICD-10. Here, MT is often grouped under the broader umbrella of psychosis-like experiences, or what are sometimes called subthreshold psychotic symptoms.
And how does it differ from the MT seen in OCD?
While it's associated with the schizophrenia spectrum, the presentation is typically different from the ritualistic cause and effect fears seen in OCD. In schizophrenia or schizotypal disorders, MT might manifest more as things like ideas of reference.
Ideas of reference.
Yeah, where the person believes that random external events, like, say, a news anchor making a specific gesture on TV, or a particular line of dialogue in a song they overhear, or the way cars are parked on the street, are specifically referencing them or sending them hidden messages, guided by some kind of magical, personalized connection to the world.
So across all these clinical scenarios, from the seemingly irrational financial choices to severe mental health conditions, the underlying commonality seems to be this deep human struggle. A struggle to impose control or find meaning in what often feels like an unpredictable, chaotic, and sometimes frightening world.
Absolutely. That seems to be the core driver. And when this struggle escalates, particularly in OCD, it's not only maintained but actively strengthened by a pathological, vicious cycle. A cycle that's extremely difficult to break without targeted intervention.
Okay, let's detail that specific cycle. The self-reinforcing loop that drives pathological magical thinking, especially in OCD. How does it work?
Right. The cycle typically begins with the obsession. That's the intrusive, highly distressing, unwanted thought, image, or urge. Let's use the example from before. The catastrophic fear that a parent might crash their car on the way home.
Okay, the trigger.
Exactly. This immediately generates intense anxiety and emotional distress, often accompanied by that feeling of inflated responsibility. If they crash, it will be my fault because I had this thought or because I didn't do my ritual.
A terrible feeling.
Overwhelming. So to alleviate this unbearable feeling, the person performs a compulsion. This is the ritualistic action. Perhaps in this case, it's meticulously checking the car tires exactly 3 times before the parent leaves.
And does that help?
It provides a rush of temporary relief. The anxiety level drops, maybe significantly, which feels good in the moment. But, and here's the absolute critical point, the crux of the problem, that compulsion simultaneously reinforces the magical link.
How does it reinforce it? Because the feared event, the car crash, didn't actually happen, so the brain registers that the ritual must have worked.
Precisely. The brain incorrectly learns, aha, I checked the tires 3 times, and look, the crash was prevented. Therefore, checking the tires 3 times keeps my parent safe. This false sense of success, this illusory correlation, makes the obsession feel even more valid and threatening the next time it pops up. And it makes the compulsion feel even more necessary and rigid, locking the sufferer into an increasingly elaborate, time-consuming, and debilitating ritualistic life.
Wow, that cycle is truly vicious. Now, the cognitive construction that seems best studied in this realm, the thing that really underpins this whole belief system, is something called thought-action fusion, or TA. This sounds almost like the literal definition of the psychological problem itself.
TF is absolutely central, particularly in OCD research. It's essentially the perception, the deep feeling that one's internal mental activity, just a thought, carries the same weight, the same moral significance, and sometimes even the same causal impact as an external physical action.
Okay.
The literature often separates TF into 2 distinct and equally devastating components. The first is called predictive TF.
Predictive TF.
This is the belief that simply thinking about a negative event actually increases its objective probability of occurring in the real world. For example, if a person is anxiously waiting for a loved one to call them back, and they have the intrusive thought, oh my God, what if they were in a terrible car crash? Predictive TAF dictates that having that thought has now somehow made the car crash genuinely more likely to happen.
Just the thought itself increases the risk. And the second component, you said it addresses the moral weight of these thoughts.
That's the moral TF. And this is perhaps the more emotionally devastating component for many people, especially for individuals who are otherwise highly conscientious and morally sound. Moral TAF is the belief that merely having an unacceptable or disturbing thought is the moral equivalent of actually performing the unacceptable action.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say someone have a fleeting, unwanted, aggressive thought about hurting their partner during a heated argument. With moral TAF, that thought doesn't just feel unpleasant. It feels as morally damaging, as sinful, as reprehensible, as if they had actually physically harmed their partner. This drives immense feelings of guilt, shame, and self-loathing, often necessitating elaborate mental or physical rituals of atonement or purification to try and undo the perceived moral damage of the thought itself.
Given how deeply entrenched these fear systems and these reinforcing cycles can become, what practical strategies for coping and management do the sources recommend, particularly for trying to break that perceived magical causal link?
The therapeutic strategies really focus on cognitive restructuring, aimed squarely at shrinking that inflated sense of responsibility that fuels the whole thing. One primary tool mentioned is actively working on defleeting responsibility.
How do you do that?
It involves actively, consciously, and rationally confronting the role of chance and simple misfortune in the world. The individual is encouraged, often with therapist guidance, to acknowledge and accept that sometimes bad things just happen, by accident. They're nobody's fault, and they certainly weren't caused by a stray thought someone had. This helps fill the vacuum of responsibility that the OCD cycle thrives in.
So it's about reminding oneself that the world is inherently uncertain, sometimes chaotic, but not necessarily personally punitive based on your thoughts.
Exactly. Another related strategy is to consciously acknowledge other forces. When contemplating a feared negative event, the individual might be instructed to make a deliberate list of every single external factor, agency, person, or circumstance involved in that event that is completely beyond their personal control.
Why make that list?
It's an exercise designed to diminish self-blame. By recognizing the multitude of other factors at play, it helps highlight that their involvement in a situation, even just mentally thinking about it, does not equate to sole or even primary responsibility for the outcome. For instance, if the fear is about a plane crash, listing factors like weather, aircraft maintenance, pilot training, air traffic control, hundreds of things, it helps put their own intrusive thought into perspective. It wasn't just about whether they blinked when they walked into the room.
Right, diluting the perceived personal impact. And fundamentally, one has to challenge the magical causal link itself head on.
Yes, the sources strongly advocate for practicing skepticism. This involves deliberately trying to suspend belief, to reserve judgment about that assumed magical link between thought ritual and outcome.
How do you practice skepticism about something that feels so real?
A crucial exercise described is asking the client to challenge their own reasoning, to apply their skepticism selectively. For example, the therapist might ask, "Okay, you believe that avoiding the number 13 keeps you safe from harm. Why don't you also believe that your horoscope accurately predicts your day, or that black cats crossing your path cause bad luck? What makes your specific superstition the one true piece of magic operating in the universe, while you dismiss all the others?"
Forcing a confrontation with the inconsistency.
Precisely. This kind of cognitive dissonance, when applied consistently, has been shown in studies to help reduce the overall conviction in magical thinking. It helps sufferers gain some critical distance and perspective on their own beliefs.
But surely, when the magical thinking becomes truly debilitating, as in severe OCD, just simple cognitive reframing or practicing skepticism often isn't enough on its own to break that powerful anxiety-compulsion cycle. What's considered the gold standard treatment in those cases?
You're absolutely right. For moderate to severe cases, the gold standard, the most effective intervention we have according to the evidence, is exposure and response prevention, or ERP.
ERP.
Yes,
Yep.
it's a highly specialized behavioral form of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. And ERP is designed to directly attack and dismantle that reinforcement cycle we talked about earlier.
How does it work? Exposure and response prevention.
It involves systematically, gradually, and collaboratively exposing the individual to the very trigger, the situation, or the intrusive thought that usually sets off their anxiety and obsessions. That's the exposure part.
Okay.
And then, this is the crucial and often very difficult part. The individual must deliberately resist performing the compulsion or ritual that they would normally use to reduce the anxiety. That's the response prevention part.
So, face the fear, but don't do the safety behavior. The goal must be habituation, right? To teach the brain through direct experience that the feared outcome doesn't actually happen even if the ritual is omitted.
Precisely. Let's use a concrete example. Suppose a person has a compulsion where they feel they absolutely must count their steps whenever they walk and ensure the total number is always even, otherwise they believe their spouse will be harmed in some way. A clear, magical link between counting and safety.
Okay.
The ERP strategy would involve having the person deliberately walk a certain distance without counting their steps at all. They would be guided to just walk normally and then sit with the intense spike of anxiety that follows without resorting to any counting or checking rituals.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is, initially. But the person is supported by the therapist to stay in that discomfort until the anxiety naturally starts to decrease on its own, which it always does eventually through habituation. Over repeated exposures, doing this again and again, the individual learns directly, experientially, that the feared consequence harm coming to their spouse does not occur, even though they didn't count. The magical link is fundamentally broken, not just by talking about it, but by proving it wrong through lived experience.
That sounds like a really powerful process. Challenging, yes, but powerful. Moving someone from a life dictated by debilitating, illogical rituals back toward a more rational, functional way of living based on reality.
It is the most effective intervention currently available, demonstrating significant improvement, even remission, for a large majority, perhaps around 80%, of OCD sufferers who complete a course of ERP. The therapeutic goal isn't just to talk about the thoughts, it's to actively disrupt the neural circuit that maintains that magical link between the obsession and the compulsion, replacing the fleeting, short-term relief of the ritual with long-term recovery based on real-world evidence.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful journey, hasn't it? It really shows us that magical thinking isn't just some quirky human tendency we occasionally indulge in. It's a central, measurable cognitive phenomenon, and it has a tangible price, whether that's the economic cost of irrationally avoiding financial gain or the profound emotional and functional cost of clinical anxiety disorders like OCD.
I think the synthesis that emerges is pretty clear. Magical thinking appears to be a deep, probably evolved, dual-system phenomenon. It influences us right across the spectrum of human experience.
Yeah.
It causes perfectly rational actors in an economic experiment to irrationally avoid maximizing their profit because of this vague fear of tempting fate. And at the other end, it provides a kind of protective, albeit highly pathological, pseudo-control mechanism for individuals struggling with severe anxiety. The underlying drive, it seems, nearly always, is the fundamental human need to find meaning, exert control, or impose structure on a world that is often defined by uncertainty and randomness.
So perhaps we can end with this provocative thought that comes out of the source material. Magical thinking, particularly the complex forms we see operating in the adult mind, isn't merely a failure to outgrow some kind of childish remnant. It actually requires quite sophisticated symbolic and abstract thought to maintain and enforce the intricate rules, the connections, the rituals involved.
That's a fascinating point. The irrational belief system isn't necessarily simple.
Right, which suggests that the ongoing struggle, or maybe the dynamic balance between logical fact and intuitive magic, isn't just a developmental phase we pass through. It might be a core, complex, cognitive process that actually coexists with rationality throughout adult life, constantly maintained and reinforced by powerful psychological mechanisms like thought-action fusion. It suggests the adult human mind might be inherently designed to manage, or perhaps constantly grapple with, this very tension between the rational and the seemingly magical.
A powerful observation indeed. It certainly challenges our easy assumptions about what it always means to be a rational decision maker, doesn't it?
It really does. Well, we certainly hope this deep dive has provided you, our listener, with a clearer understanding of some of the forces at play, perhaps, in your own intuitive beliefs and everyday superstitions, and also in the clinical diagnoses that can arise when these processes become extreme.
Yeah, it touches many aspects of life.
Absolutely. So we encourage you, as always, to subscribe, like, and comment on this deep dive, and maybe tell us, what specific aspect of magical thinking, whether it's an everyday superstition, that feeling of tempting fate, or something else, have you observed most directly influencing decision-making, either in your own life or in the world around you? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for joining us for this exploration.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.